Welcome back, officially baseball season. You wouldn't know that from watching Masson on your television. Of course, you can keep a live look on Twitter sometimes at Adam Jones playing catch or something like that. But Luke Jones now joins us. We are not in Sarasota this year because I quite frankly figured, what's the point? I know some of the media went down there and threw microphones in the face of Machado and Scope, and we had team pictures on Tuesday. But lo and behold, Luke Jones, that Coonsford WNST text service alive with the sounds of Chris Tillman. And I think we all saw this coming last July and August when the employees of Masson started to talk about, why not bring back Chris Tillman next year? Well, as my headline out on Facebook and YouTube says, Luke Jones and Nestor attempt to make excuses for why the Orioles would want Chris Tillman to pitch every fifth day. I'm going to welcome you in and leave you with this. 7.84. Luke Jones, Chris Tillman's your starting pitcher. What say you?
Well, I'm fine with this from a standpoint of if you're not banking on him definitely being one of your five starting pitchers.
Well, they certainly gave him enough money to be one of their starting five, right?
$3 million is a drop in the bucket. I mean, it really is. That is nothing when it comes to a starting pitcher in this day and age. Let's just face reality. I'm not saying $3 million is nothing in general, but you're kind of getting what you pay for in that regard. And the Orioles are clearly banking on Chris Tillman being healthier than he was a year ago, and they're banking on what he did the previous 5 years. Now, if he's coming in to compete as your number 5 starter, and you have some other younger options, and maybe you add another Chris Tillman type guy to add to that mix, another $2 or $3 or $4 million flyer, then I kind of like this move. But I don't like this move if it's basically signaling the end of any meaningful additions to your starting rotation, because as we talked about with Andrew Kashner, I'd feel a lot better about him if he were the number 4 starter, and then if Chris Tillman were competing for that number 5 spot with Miguel Castro and Nestor Cortez, and like I said, if you bring in another veteran flyer, a guy who is coming off of an injury, a down season, whatever, then I think you feel a little bit better about that. But as it currently is constructed, this starting rotation has Andrew Kashner as its number 3. We've already talked about the red flags there as far as him regressing from where he was from an ERA standpoint last year. And as you pointed out, and I'm not going to disagree, I mean, Chris Tillman was not just bad in 2017, he was historically poor. You just go through the numbers, and he was one of 8 pitchers since 1929 to have an ERA of 7.50, having thrown at least 90 innings. So, I mean, that's all you need to know. I mean, if they're certainly not signing him anticipating him doing what he did last year, but that said, last year happened. And certainly anyone who's watched him pitch, even going back to the end of 2016, when the shoulder issue first cropped up, you see that his arm slot's been different. He threw from more of a 3/4 position last year, and that clearly didn't work for him. So the one thing I will say is he's worked out at their facility throughout the offseason. I would think they have a pretty good beat on where he is physically, on where he is with his mechanics.
Well, we all saw this coming, right? I mean,
no question.
It was just about, like, how much stupid money are they going to give him? And in an era when the old man fought with Frank Wren over $250,000 because it was a lot of money, and fought with Xavier Hernandez and changed everything about the organization over $1 million. Man, giving $3 million to a guy with an 8 ERA who's not a big league pitcher at this point and has done nothing to prove to me that he's a big league pitcher that you can win with at any point. I'm sort of shocked that they wouldn't just let Nestor Cortez pitch or let whomever. I mean, name anybody. I like Nestor Cortez for obvious reasons, but somebody cheap. Tyler Wright, any of these guys, right? Mike Wright, Tyler Wilson. You know what I meant.
Yeah, but again, it's $3 million. This is not a big commitment. I mean, we need to stop thinking about $3 million like it was $3 million 10 years ago or 15 years ago. $3 million is what
I can't stop thinking of it as monopoly money, dude. It's not monopoly money. It's $3 million. It would be the difference between them signing Manny Machado for $27 million or $30 million a year. I promise you, it would be.
If you don't like the player, that's fine. But you're squabbling over $3 million. Look at the money they completely peed away on Ubaldo Jimenez and Yovani Gallardo and Wade Miley and Bud Norris in 2015. I mean, that was real money that those guys were getting. This isn't real money. It's $3 million. I mean,
they cut Miguel Gonzalez over $5, and he was a legitimate major league pitcher.
Understood, and we've said that was a mistake. I mean, all I'm saying is, and we said this over and over and over again last year. Do you think Chris Tillman was healthy last year? Yes or no?
No.
So if you think he's healthy and you think he's going to be better, then to me, $3 million is a decent investment. If he's your number 5 starter, that's where I have the bigger issue. It's not signing Chris Tillman. I think it's a fine flyer to sign someone who has a track record over 5 years prior to last season of being a really solid, maybe not a bona fide ace, we know that, but a solid top half of the rotation starter in the American League East. If he's healthy, and look, if he's healthy, that doesn't mean he's going to necessarily have a 3.5 ERA again. It might be a Chris Tillman who has a 4.2 ERA, but you know what? For $3 million, that's a really good investment. So I'm fine with it from that standpoint. Where my point of contention is Chris Tillman has no business being penciled in as your number 4 starter, which is where they stand right now until they potentially go out and get another starting pitcher. I know Dan Duquette has said they're still in that market, but unless they're going out and opening up the checkbook for an Alex Cobb or a Lance Lynn, which, oh, by the way, look at their payroll right now compared to where it was last year. It's estimated to be about $30 million lower. Why aren't they in on these guys? They have the money to go out and sign one of those 2 pitchers if they want to do it. So will they? I'm not holding my breath, but my issue with Tillman is not at all about signing him for $3 million. I think that's a fine risk to take, and it's not much of a risk. But I don't like the idea that you're just going to hand him a job as the number 4 starter because he had an ERA of over 7.5 last year.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke on Twitter and Luke at WNST.net if you want to find him. With the Orioles in spring training right now, what are you watching and looking for in some of these games? I mean, for me, I'll be watching Nestor Cortez, but every other Nestor Cortez. I mean, who will be that guy we hadn't heard of who's going to pitch well, the Michael Givens type of thing a couple years? You know, somebody's going to steal the show and come out of this thing because I think there's certainly enough jobs up to be won and certainly enough influence to be held inside the organization that things aren't all set in stone in this organization, and I think some guys have to go down and play well in spring training to make the team.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. I think that's true. I think, it's obvious to say, looking at the starting pitching, as far as whoever, assuming they don't bring anyone else in beyond another minor league free agent waiver wire kind of player, which I'm guessing that's what they'll end up doing if they're going to add another starting pitcher, because all indications can suggest that Alex Cobb and Lance Lynn are still asking for more than what the Orioles want to pay. So until that changes, you assume that they're not going to be a player for either of those guys. So Nestor Cortez, obviously, I think Miguel Castro, who they're stretching out. Certainly we saw him pitch well for large stretches of last season, although he did wear down a little bit at the end of the season. Didn't have a great strikeout rate, despite the fact that he does throw really hard and does have some good stuff. So I'm still very skeptical of whether that will translate to him being successful in a starting role. But of the incumbents, of the internal candidates that they have, he's probably the most compelling. And as you mentioned, Nestor Cortez being a Rule 5 guy. So there's a reason why the Yankees didn't put him on their 40-man roster. Let's not expect him to be the next Clayton Kershaw or anything crazy like that. But they seem to.
I was hoping Santana.
Yeah, right. Yeah. The old Rule 5 magic. But it really you're looking at those guys, but beyond that, and that's the Captain Obvious group to pay attention to. But I'll give you the other name. The Orioles have talked a lot about acquiring a lefty hitting outfielder. They brought in Alex Presley of the Detroit Tigers on a minor league deal earlier this week. They've been talking about Colby Rasmus, who has had his moments at the major league level, but last year injuries and actually walked away from the game for a while. So I'm not all that hot and bothered about that prospect. But to me, I want to see what Austin Hayes does this spring. Last year at this time, no one was really expecting Trey Mancini to be on the 25-man roster. I mean, you just looked at it. It was a logjam. They had Trumbo that they had just re-upped. They had Chris Davis in the second year of his albatross of a contract. There was no room for Trey Mancini, right? Well, he ended up winning a job, ended up playing the outfield, and ended up being one of the better rookies in baseball last year. So can Austin Hayes have a similar spring training where he plays so well that he kind of forces the Orioles' hand into making him the everyday right fielder? That I think that's certainly a possibility at this point in time. I think it's, I don't think it's a given. Unlike Mancini, Hayes isn't someone who's had a glutton of minor league experience to draw from, like Mancini basically mastered every single level. So, can Austin Hayes show that he belongs and emerge as the everyday right fielder? I mean, I think that would be a way more attractive option than throwing Alex Presley out there or Anthony Santander out there or bringing in Colby Rasmus or any number of things you could do in that regard. So he's someone I'm definitely going to be watching from a standpoint of he's had so much success so soon after being drafted, had his cup of coffee last September, didn't really play all that well, but no one played well last September for the Orioles if you try to remember. But it really is, that there's really a job to be won there if he can play so well this spring that the Orioles basically say, like they did with Mancini last year, that how can we not keep this guy on the 25-man roster? So the rotation's the obvious thing to be watching, but certainly looking forward to seeing what Austin Hayes can do this spring in those few opportunities we get to watch the Orioles on TV.
Yeah, the few. That never makes any sense, right? I
hear you.
I don't want to bitch about it for the 13th year in a row, but it makes no sense at all. I mean, it's a theft of money by the Angelos family to take our money and not give us spring training baseball, or at least give us 2 cameras and pay Jim Hunter $250 to sit there in flip-flops and talk about what's going on or whatever. So, either way. Luke Jones joining us here. He is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter and Luke at WNST.net. All of his reports, of course, brought to you by Brooks Huff and what they do up and down York Road. You know about them. So many years in business in the Shrewsbury location. So a little shout-out for Luke's sponsor there in Brooks Huff. And we'll be doing some football next week. We'll be going to the Combine, and I know you were on Jarvis Landry watch, as was, I think, everyone out in Owings Mills and Miami and other parts unknown. News breaks every day. We don't send text out on all of this stuff, but the Landry thing was of particular note to Ravens fans. Yeah, and let's face it. I mean, the Jarvis Landry pipe dream was probably going to remain a pipe dream from a standpoint of the Ravens don't have a whole lot of salary cap room. There was going to be a heavy market for him. He was going to be considered the top wide receiver on that market, unless, you might have a few people talking about Allen Robinson from Jacksonville, who, by the way, will probably also end up getting the franchise tag. Well, when a team gives you $14 million, they kind of want to keep you around, right? Yeah, and I know there was already some speculation on Tuesday night that the Dolphins may try to trade Landry, but good luck with that. I mean, what? So a team has to pay him a ridiculous contract and give up a draft pick? I mean, that doesn't sound appetizing. So, but the reality is the Ravens didn't have a whole lot of salary cap space. Even though I do expect them to be more aggressive at the wide receiver position. I mean, frankly, they need to be. They can't go the post June 1st route again. I think they saw how that worked out last year, and they've seen how that's worked out in the past. But Landry was going to be the top wide receiver on the market, or at least one of the top 2, was going to be paid very handsomely. There was going to be plenty of demand for him. So I didn't like the Ravens' chances of landing him anyway. But the reality is these types of talents, I mean, go through, and I even went to some of the different sites that have some of the contract information, and you just go through the top 10 or 15 wide receiver cap numbers around the NFL, and nearly every single one of them, except for Deshaun Jackson, and I believe Golden Tate came in at maybe number 15, number 16, something like that, off the top of my head. The rest of them, all drafted talents, re-signed
with their original team. These types of talents, it happens sometimes, and certainly Alshon Jeffrey last year hit the market, but for the most part, these types of special wide receivers are kind of like quarterbacks. They don't hit free agency. So now the reality for the Ravens, they're going to have to look at the draft. I still think there's some decent talent on this wide receiver market. It's just there's not that bona fide, clear-cut number one.
Well, we're going to get to know, all the wide receivers and all the rest of these guys with, every Mike Mayock and Mel Kiper, all in our ear beginning next week at the Combine. So for me, it really does begin my educational process next week. I've put no effort into it at all. I'll start to put effort into it over the weekend, and by the time you and I hit the ground on Tuesday afternoon, we'll have 10 names or 12 names of wide receivers, right? We'll be looking at maybe a right tackle, right? We'll be looking at, who even on the defensive side. We'll be looking at those second and third and fourth round quarterbacks probably, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. We've talked about that quarterback position quite a bit. I don't think the Ravens are looking for the guy to replace Joe Flacco, certainly this year or probably next year, but they're looking for someone to upgrade from Ryan Mallett and maybe has a little more upside. But the wide receivers, we've talked about Calvin Ridley a lot. We'll continue to talk about Calvin Ridley a lot. A lot of the draft pundits believe he's the only wide receiver that's really worth taking in the middle of the first round. But as we saw last year with Corey Davis and that trio of wide receivers in the first round, that they were off the board long before the Ravens even had a chance to pick. Wide receivers are highly coveted because they're difficult to find, they're difficult to draft, they're difficult to develop. The Ravens know that better than anyone. So, but the good thing about this year's draft is there does seem to be a lot of enthusiasm for players in that second to third round range, and we've seen it every year. Look at last year with Pittsburgh with Smith-Schuster. There are good talents to be had on that second day of the draft if you're willing to invest the picks. The Ravens every year, and every year, and we'll hear Eric DeCosta say this in a couple months at the pre-draft luncheon, that every year they feel that there's a wide receiver, at least one in every round that can help the team. Well, the problem with the Ravens, for the most part, is they've waited to the 5th or 6th or 7th round to try to do that. And this year, if it's not in the first round, if Calvin Ridley's not there, don't force it. Then address another position. But day two, second round, third round, pull the trigger and don't be afraid to draft a couple wide receivers. It really comes down to it. If you really need one, kind of treat it like baseball teams treat starting pitching. If you want to develop a starting pitcher, you better have 3 or 4. So maybe not draft 3 or 4 wide receivers, but if you really need one and you really are desperate to have one make an impact, well, don't be afraid to draft 2 then. So that's where I think they need to be, and we'll see what happens. And keep in mind, one name that could kind of fall into that second or third round territory is DJ Moore from Maryland, who had a really, really good career for the Terps. And I think a lot of people seeing what Stephon Diggs has done in the NFL might be clamoring for the Ravens not to overlook someone right down the road. So it's very clear the pressure is going to be on them. We know they don't have a great amount of cap space. We know that they're picking in the middle of each round. We know that Calvin Ridley is kind of the one guy that you look at in the first round, and he might be gone 6 picks before the Ravens select. So,
by the way, they're getting a pick for Ricky Wagner. I had forgotten about that. Dennis reminded me of that, and I'm like, all right, so that by the end of Friday night they'll have 4 players allegedly, right?
Yeah, and it should be not just a comp pick, but a good comp.
A third round,
right?
Yeah.
Because it was such a big contract, and he ended up playing.
So they'll get 3 players on Friday after 1 on Thursday. Yep.
Yeah. Now that's not official. Just for anyone listening, though, they always announce that.
That's our speculation here at WNST.
Yeah, but they announce that at the owners' meetings and have that all figured out. Or actually, I guess they do that before now, but we'll find out.
Or as Billick says, out of the cosmos.
yeah. But that really that gives them an extra pick. And keep in mind, you can trade comp picks now too. So if they're in a position where there's a wide receiver that they really like in the second or third round, and they need to move up to get him, go get him. I can't encourage that enough. This team has to bring in some impact talent, and not just a wide receiver, but tight end. I think they have to do better at the tight end position. The last few years, they've kind of they've added Ben Watson, but beyond that, they've really relied on hoping some of these young guys would pop, and it just hasn't happened. Nick Boyle's a fine number 2 blocking tight end, but he's not a receiver. He's not going to make an impact in that regard. Max Williams, I think we pretty much know what he is at this point. I think injuries are a big reason why he hasn't popped. I don't know if that's going to happen at this point. I don't think you can count on that. So you can't trust Darren Waller because he can't stay clean enough to stay on the field. So I think they need to go after that position as well. So I think it's very clear what the Ravens need to do. I think you look at their day 1 and day 2 draft picks, you have to invest some of those at wide receiver and tight end. And they're going to have to go out and you can't just rely on rookies. You're going to have to go out and at least find a veteran or two who has some upside. Whether it's someone like a Dante Moncrief from Indianapolis who had a really good season a couple years ago and then had some injuries and obviously dealt with Andrew Luck not being on the field as well. Maybe you take a flyer on someone like that who maybe you're not going to spend a lot of money on, but maybe you see the upside there and gets into a new setting and pops a little bit more. But there's him, there's Paul Richardson, there's Sammy Watkins. I mean, some of these guys are going to end up getting overpaid just because there aren't going to be those marquee names at the top of that wide receiver free agent list. But I think the Ravens, this needs to be a multi-pronged attack in terms of addressing the wide receiver position. Can't just be one draft pick. Can't just be one free agent signing. You need a combination if you truly want to make yourselves better at that position and set yourself up in a better way moving forward.
You can find him at Baltimore Luke on Twitter and, of course, at WNST.net anytime. And if there is breaking news on any aspect of life, you'll get it first on the WNST Tech Service. It's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. You can find him, Luke, at WNST.net as well. You can find both of us out in the buyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. We do come in crystal clear from anywhere in the world. Luke and I will be in Indianapolis all next week. Full coverage on the radio, on the web, everywhere we are with the NFL in mind. And, of course, I'll be at the NFL owners meetings next month. Hold March the 29th. It's Thursday night. It's opening day for baseball. That night, we're bringing head coach Barry Trotz out from the Washington Capitals to swab for the Bone Marrow Red Shoe. We'll be giving you more information on that as we get closer to that date. We've also got our Ray Lewis bus now on its 4th bus to Canton, Ohio in August. We're doing the football game, the Bears and the Ravens. We're doing some baseball in Cleveland, some baseball in Pittsburgh, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. All the details up under the Road Trips tab at WNST.net. Our morning newspaper ships directly to your email inbox. It's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com, where it's still $10 a month. The Pimlico and Laurel entries, the Maryland Jockey Club, putting their entries in our morning newspaper beginning March 1st. You'll want to be on the lookout for that if you are headed down to the track. And, of course, they're racing this weekend at Laurel, as they're always doing. We're going to get Stan Salter on here to talk some racing next week as well. Nasty at WNST.net is the way to find me. I am on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook Live as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.